At this point, we covered a lot of crucial Angular concepts already, but of course the demo application we're working on didn't make too much progress. But it is of course super important to have this solid foundation and to know about all these core concepts I did explain over the last lectures. That being said, I now want to continue working on this UI though. And for example, the idea with this user here, of course, is not to have a single user that changes whenever we click on them, but instead to have a list of users here where we have multiple user items, which when we click on them, load their tasks, which should then show up on the right here. And therefore, as a next step, I want to work on that list of users. And therefore, I first want to make sure that this user component can be used multiple times so that we can use one and the same user component here multiple times but with different data. Because that's another big advantage of this components approach. You don't just split your user interface into those building blocks, hence simplifying those individual building blocks, but you also have reusable building blocks. And of course, not every component needs to be reused. The header component, for example, is only used once here, but some components are reused. Like this user component, which is meant to be output multiple times with different data. Now, of course, we can go to the app component here and simply copy and paste this list item with the user component multiple times to output multiple users like this. But if we do that, it's always the same user, at least initially until we change it. And it's always the same user initially because in the user component, we initially calculate this random index. And this is done only once when this file is first parsed. And then we use this random index to select one random user, which we use as a starting value. And that's of course not the idea. Instead, I actually don't want to pick any random index or random user at all here. And I also don't want to change the selected user when we click on them. So we can get rid of this code here. I also don't need a selected user here at all, because the idea is not to show different users inside of that user component. So we can get rid of all of that and clean up this user component class. And therefore, of course, also get rid of this import here. And get rid of the computed and signal functions that are being imported. Because instead, I want to make my app user component configurable so that we can set attributes, properties to be precise, on that component here, on that element tag, just as we can do it on built-in elements. That would be a nice feature because that would then allow us to really reuse one and the same component, but with different data. And that is, of course, a crucial feature that is supported by Angular. To accept such inputs, such settable properties on your components, you have to go to the component that should accept the input, and then as a first step, add a property that should be settable from outside. For example, here we could say that we want to accept this avatar here, so this image of the user as an input. And we do that by adding a property named avatar, for example, and by then decorating it with another decorator. So decorators like this component decorator can not just be added to classes, but instead also to properties of classes. And the decorator we need to add here to this property is the input decorator, which is also imported from @Angular core. It's this input decorator that's added here, and that's then also executed like a function by adding parentheses here. And this will mark this property as settable from outside. And I'll fix this error, which I have here in just a second. But with input added here, we can then go to the place where we use our component as an element, and then there set this avatar property. And we can use property binding here as well to set it to a dynamic value. Now that of course means that here in this case we have to make sure that the app component has access to all the users, so that we can set them here in its template. And therefore in the app component TS file we can start by importing the dummy users from this dummy users file. And we can then add a property to the app component so that we can get access to that data from inside the template of this component. And that property could be called users, and we set it equal to dummy users, for example. This is how we can expose this imported data in the template of this component. Now in the app component HTML file, we could set the avatar of this first user here to users. Then we can access the first user with index 0 and access the avatar property. This is how we could set this. And of course, on the second user element here, we could then access the second user by using an index of 1, like that. And we will soon learn about a more efficient mechanism for outputting multiple components based on some array data, but for now we can do it manually like this, for the first 4 users, let's say. And now we of course still have an error in the user component TypeScript file though. The error is that the avatar member, so this property of this class, implicitly has an any type. And that's now a complaint by TypeScript, which we have to fix here. And thus far we didn't have to deal with such complaints because thus far we only worked with properties or constants or variables that received an initial value. But if you have a property like this, which at the moment doesn't have an initial value, because we expect that value to be set from outside this component, TypeScript complains that it doesn't know which type of value will eventually be received here. And it's kind of TypeScript's main thing to know which kind of value is being used where. That's why it's complaining here. Therefore, what we should do here is explicitly assign a value type to this property. By adding a colon here, that's a special TypeScript feature that you can assign a type to a property, for example, by adding a colon after the property name. And by then setting the type that will be received here. And in this case, this will be a string. And that's now one of the types that are built into TypeScript and that are supported out of the box. You have string, number, Boolean, and you can also set up more complex object types, for example, though we'll take a look at that later. For the moment, we can just use a string here because the avatar will be a string, and we now get a different error. We get an error that the property avatar has no initializer and is not definitely assigned in the constructor. Which in the end means that TypeScript now knows that this should be a string, but it does not understand that we're using an Angular mechanism for receiving the value of this property. All TypeScript sees is that there is no value being set at any point in this component. Instead, it's an uninitialized property. And that's exactly what this complaint is about. Now, we can work around that by adding an exclamation mark after the property name. That's another TypeScript feature which simply tells TypeScript that we know that this will definitely be set to some value even though TypeScript can't see it in this code. But of course we know that the value will be set from outside here by assigning an avatar value when we use the user component. And that's now how we can get this avatar property value from outside this component and how we can therefore reuse this app user component. Now, of course, we can add more inputs and also add an input for the name, which will also be a string, so that we can also set the user name from outside the user component. And therefore, in the app component, we can now also set the name here and also use property binding there to set it to a dynamic value and set the name to users0.name in this case. And then repeat this for all the instances of this user component, just with different indexes like that. And now there's just one last step, and that is that we should bring back this computed image path here using a getter again, since I'm not using a signal here, because I'm relying on that image path in that template, right? I'm using it here. So we should actually again return that image path here, which was assets/users/ and then add this avatar to the path. And now as a final step, we just have to update the user template again because we're not using signals anymore, so all these parentheses here have to go. Not the parentheses here, because this is still an event binding, but in all the places where we access properties. And actually, we don't have a selected user anymore. Instead, now we just have a name property, which contains the name of the user. And with all that, if we save this, you see that if I reload, I now got a list of users here, and every user outputs some different data. And that's the idea behind using inputs like this, which make your components configurable and therefore more reusable.